In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from the Kendo UI library, the Kendo Grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 list of backlog items is to make it pageable and sortable. The Kendo Grid can handle these features as well as over 100 other features. You can find the documentation about all the features of the grid in the Kendo docs. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I suggest having this site open while you develop so that you can use it for reference. In this chapter, we'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items. Then we'll add paging and sorting, and finally, we'll see how to use the grid with a convenient data query module. We're going to add the Kendo Grid to our backlog page. You can get to the backlog page by just clicking backlog in the navigation. Right now, it's just displaying a table of items, a very long table of items. That's one of the reasons we need paging here. So we're going to convert this table to a Kendo Grid, and we still want to be able to retain the filtering capability that we have right now using the My Items, Open Items, and Done Items buttons at the top. Notice the URL also maintains the state of the filter, so we want to make sure that all works together when we throw the Kendo Grid into the mix. Let's hop over to the documentation, and we'll begin with grid installation. Under Components, find Data Grid, and click on Getting Started. I'll scroll down to the installation. Let's copy that and head out to the terminal. And just as usual, I'm going to paste the npm install command on the terminal and run it. In package.json, you'll see the grid installed. Let's find where we're going to be placing this grid. In source, modules, backlog, pages, backlog, and then backlog page tsx. We're going to scroll down here and find the backlog list component. This is our own custom component that accepts items from the backlog page. And if we navigate to this component, it should be under Components and Backlog List. There it is. You'll see that this is just an HTML table that simply renders one row per issue. There's also a backlog row component. We might peek in here when we need to fill out the templates for the grid columns to use. Hint, hint, you'll be doing some exercises on this later on. All right, let's continue on with rendering the grid. Now that we have our grid component installed, let's add it to our backlog page. If you don't already have backlogpage.tsx open, you can find it in Modules, Backlog, Pages, Backlog, and then Backlog Page. Or in Visual Studio Code, you can just hit F1, delete the greater than sign, and type in backlog page, and then select it. This will open up the file. Just a quick note about the render here. The app preset filter, this contains those three buttons at the top, My Items, Open Items, and Done Items that do the filtering. And then the backlog list, that's a custom component that renders our items that we pass into it as props. I'm going to press F12 on backlog list, and it opens up the backlog-list tsx file. And this file has the table that currently renders our items. This is the header of the table, and you'll see that we have these 7 columns here. There's one for icon that doesn't have a name, assignee, title, status, priority, estimate, created. You might recognize these as properties on each PT item. And we have a variety of different renderings that we can play around with here for displaying different types of data in each of these columns. This is where we're actually rendering the rows, and for each of the rows, we're rendering a backlog row custom component, passing in one item. Let's take a look at that component. This component shows each piece of table data for each row and how they're rendered. For example, the first row has an image for an icon of the type of PT item it is. The second one is the image for the avatar of the user, and so on. We're going to come back to this when we define columns. So we're not getting rid of this backlog row. We're going to use this for reference later on. But we will come back to the backlog page component because instead of the backlog list, we're going to house our grid in a separate backlog grid component. And we'll pass in the items into this component just like we did before into our list. In fact, I'll keep the list on the page just temporarily so we can do a comparison, a visual comparison. So we need to create this backlog grid component, and it's going to be very similar to our backlog list component. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the backlog list component, paste a copy of it inside the components folder, and let's rename this to backlog grid. And inside there, I'm going to rename the file to backlog grid. And anywhere inside this function, I'm going to rename backlog list to backlog grid. Okay, now we're not going to be responsible for rendering individual rows, so I'm going to remove that. And instead of this table here, we're going to return the grid component from Telerik UI. It's not recognized right now, so I'm going to import it. And as you can see, we've got grid coming from progress/KendoReact Grid. I'll remove this unnecessary import here. Now, grid has one important attribute on it, and that's data. So we need to pass in the items, and that's going to be on the props. And there's one more thing we need to do is go back to the backlog page and make sure we import the backlog grid itself. Now let's have a quick look at our app. Okay, we have something being rendered here, and these are actually auto-generated based on the data that the grid detects for each column in the collection that we've passed in. Some of these are objects, some of them are dates. The grid automatically renders these columns for each of the properties in our data set, but it doesn't quite know how to display them. And that's what we're going to help out with in the next lesson. But for now, you can see that the grid is taking up way too much space vertically. This is our original table, by the way. It's still on this page. We'll remove it later. But I just want this grid to take up a certain amount of space vertically. So I'm going to go to the grid and I'm going to add a quick style attribute here and set the height to 400. There we go. Now the whole grid fits on the page without scrolling, and I can scroll just the grid itself. That way I'll always see my filters in the entire page. But we'll do more styling in a bit. Well, we're currently rendering a grid, but it currently doesn't look too good. Let's go back to our code, and we're going to define our first column, the simplest one here being the title column. So let's do that one. So we're going to add a subcomponent to our grid called a grid column. A grid column has a field attribute on it, which is used to bind the property of a data item to that column. So if we take a look at items, I'm going to press F12 there, and then PT item. These are the properties that we're using for each PT item. So these are the columns that are going to make up the grid. A grid field attribute needs to match these names. If we look at the PT object base, you see that we have title in there. So let's go back down to our grid column. And here we want to display the title column. And if I save that, this is enough to show that column. So there's our items, and they're all being rendered, and their titles are displaying because they're just simple strings. Our header in the grid is set to title, and this is automatically generated based on the field name. We can control that though because we want it capitalized. So I'm going to set the title attribute to title capitalized. I know we have a lot of titles here, but this attribute title is the name of that column. So now you can see that we have title up here in the header. Let's take a look at the completed application so we have a reference point. This is what our grid needs to look like in the end when we're done with it. We have our title already done. Let's add the estimate column because that also seems pretty simple. I'm going to copy the grid column here and paste it here, and I'm going to bind to estimate, and I'm going to call this estimate. Okay, so now we have two columns here, title and estimate, and each one of them is displaying the correct data. Notice we didn't have to specify the type that we're displaying. The grid automatically knows if it's a string or if it's a number and displays the appropriate values. What if our object that we want to display in each column is a complex type? For example, a date. Let's create a column here for a date, which is the created date or date created. I'm going to give it a title of created. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, we're rendering a string, which is not very good looking. We need to tell this column to render this as a date. Let's go in here and we're going to add some more attributes. One of the attributes you can add is a cell renderer. You can specify cell here, and right in line, you can specify a renderer for the cell. It's going to get props, and we can tell it how to render this cell. If you're going to override the cell renderer, you must provide the TD element, the table data element for the HTML table. This is absolutely a must. So here I'm going to define a span element, and I'm going to give it a class name of li_date, which is a predefined class name that I've created before. And inside here, I'm going to look at the props that are coming in, and it has a data item on it. Now the data item is of any type. So we could cast it here, but we know that it's of type PT item and it has a date created on it. Now, if you were to write this renderer as a function somewhere else in the code, not in line here, then you can cast data item to its proper type if you're dealing with more complex data. So here I'm going to render date created, and I'm going to call the toDate string function on it.
Okay, so now you can see we have a little bit of styling. It's a smaller font with purple color, and our dates are looking much better now. Notice how each time you add a column, the grid spaces the columns evenly. You can change that, and we are going to. So let's make the width for the date column be 160 pixels, and the estimate column, because it's just a number, it doesn't need to be that wide. So we can set this to 100. Let's see how that works. Now the title has most of the width. The estimate is limited to 100 pixels and created is 160. Great. I'd like you to try to fill in the rest of the columns yourself as an exercise. Just for reference again, you're going to need this column, the first column, which doesn't have a title. And there is a little trick to that in React Kendo. This has icons. And then we need an assignee that has a picture of an assignee and their name. We need a priority. We've done this styling earlier in the course, so you already have those styles somewhere. And then you'll be done. You can also optionally add a status column here. Our grid is starting to take shape. Let's take a look at how we can render a complex object. And an assignee is an example of one. We're going to be using a custom renderer for this. And you got a glimpse of this in the last lesson when we rendered date created. Assignee is going to be very similar. I'm going to add that right here, grid column, and the field is going to be assignee with the title of assignee with a capital A. I'll set the width to be 200 to accommodate longer names. And here we're also going to use the cell attribute, just like we did with dates, so we can get a hold of the props that has a data item, and now we can pull out the assignee from that. Don't forget that the cell has to return a table data HTML element, but whatever you put inside the table data, that's up to you. So I'm going to format this a little bit with a div, and I'm going to use an image for the user avatar. We can get that through props, data item, assignee, and then avatar. I'm going to give my image a class name of li avatar, rounded, that's a bootstrap class, and mx auto is also coming from bootstrap. Let's take a quick look at that. Great, we are getting some pictures in there now. Let's just add the name. The name is going to be a span with the margin left of 5 pixels, or let's make it 10 pixels. And here we're going to use the props, data item, assignee, full name property to display the name of that assignee. There we go. Great. So that's how we render a complex object. Let's take a look at the first column, which has an image. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in right over here. So this column is going to be bound to the type property of our item. And notice the title here. Now, if you leave the title off altogether, it'll automatically use the field name and put that in the header. So you have to specify the title with a space inside there in order for it not to show anything. And then inside of the item renderer, we have an image. We're using getIndicatorImage, and we're getting the URL for the image based on the data item. Our custom component doesn't have getIndicatorImage right now, but if we go to backlog row, this component does have getIndicatorImage, so we can just copy that helper function out and bring it over to our backlog grid component. Let's just do a quick import of item type here, and we're good to go. And there's that image column. Let's add one more. Right after the title column, we're going to add the priority. Here we also need a custom renderer because we want to add a badge, and we have this getPriority class. GetPriority class is another helper function that we can grab from backlog row. Let's copy that, and we can paste that in right over here. Don't forget to import getIndicator class as well. That's just going to return a string, which is the name of the class based on the priority of the data item. And it's using the Bootstrap badge class to give it that nice little icon shape. There's our priority column that's showing different colors as badges for each type of priority. Now we still have way too many items in this grid. Let's implement one of our requirements and add paging. We have a working grid on our backlog page, but we're showing way too many items right off the bat. In this lesson, we're going to implement paging for our Kendo grid. Let's head over to the code. And in order to implement paging, there's a couple of things we need to add to our state. In the backlog grid component, we're going to use the useState hook, and we're going to call it gridState with a complementary setGridState function. Let's import useState from React, and we're going to initialize this object with a skip property that'll determine what page we're on, and we'll initialize that to 0. And a take property, which will be 10, and that's how many items per page we want. So how do we use these skip and take properties? Back down to our grid, we can specify skip and take right in the attributes of the grid. So right here, I can specify the take attribute, and the skip attribute will also be coming from the state. But what about our data itself? Right now, we're telling the grid to look at all the items in the state. Well, we first need to take a slice of the items before we hand it over to the grid. So let's go up here right before our return statement. I'm going to create a constant called grid data, but I'm going to use the slice function to get only a piece of the data. So we want to use the skip property, and then we want to use the take. There's our grid data. It's only going to be part of the data now. Let's use this instead of the items for our grid data. Okay, so here we are. We only have 10 items listed in the grid now, but we don't have any paging implemented yet. So we are taking a slice and our filtering is working, but we're only showing the first 10 items. Let's add paging as well. The first thing we need to do is tell the grid how many items there are total. That way it knows how many pages to create. So we need to specify the total attribute,
and that's just going to be the length of the items array.
Now, if you were using this grid to asynchronously grab data from the API for every paging event, then your API backend will need to return the items for that particular page and the total number of items. This is where you'd specify the total here. You'd most likely be using server-side paging if you had a very large data set. To make this pageable, we need to set the pageable attribute to true. But that's not all. We also need to implement the onPage change event handler. Every time we change the page, the onPage change event gets triggered, which will pass us an event, and I'm going to implement the onPage change handler. Let's roll up here. I'm going to add the onPage change method, and this is going to take an event. The type of the event is grid page change event. And if we look at the properties available on that event, we have a page and we have a target. We want to use this page property, which has skip and take on it. So these are going to be the new values after the paging has happened. So what we're going to do for every page change is just set the state. We have our own skip property on the state. We're going to use the new skip property that's coming in, and take is really going to be the same, but we'll go ahead and update that as well. Let's take a look. Okay, so here's our grid. We have 10 items showing here, but down at the bottom, you'll see that we have a pager. So now if I tap on one of these items, you can see that we're paging through all our items. Great, so our paging is working as expected. Let's take a look at sorting next. The version 2 RPS tracker requirements state that we also need to have this grid sortable. Let's add sorting to our grid. We'll work backwards this time. We'll start with the grid attributes. Just like pageable and onPage changed, there's equivalent sort-related attributes that we can use. So we can use sortable, we'll set that to true, but this needs to work in tandem with an onSortChange event handler. So we'll need to implement the onSortChange event handler, and there's one more property we're going to need, and that's sort. I'm going to put that right here before sortable. Sort is actually of type sortDescriptor, and that's a special type of property that we're going to add to the state of our component. We don't have it implemented yet, but let's go up to the top and add it. So right here, I'm going to add the sort property, and it's of type sortDescriptorArray. SortDescriptor is actually coming from Kendo Data Query. This is a new module for us. It's not a component, but think of Kendo Data Query as a highly abstracted set of functions that work on your data. We're going to come back to Kendo Data Query later in this chapter, where we're going to see how easy it is to implement sorting and paging using the Kendo Data Query and its special types and processing functions. We need to instantiate the sort property. It's an array, and we can actually give it its first value, which is a sort descriptor. Now, a sort descriptor has a field on it. This is the initial field that you want to sort on. So let's sort by title initially, and we also need to provide a direction of sort. Here you can pick either ascending or descending. I'm going to pick ascending. Finally, we need the onSortChange handler, which is going to take an event of type gridSortChangeEvent. Whenever we sort, we're going to reset the state of our component, and we're going to save off the new sort property that comes in with the event.
If we have a look at this now, you'll see that title is being sorted, as indicated by this little arrow pointing up, which means we're sorting on title in ascending order. If we click on this though, all our records are gone now. Well, that's because we're overwriting our state. Whenever our sort changes, we're setting the grid state, but we're forgetting skip and take. We need to get those back in here and make sure that they're persisted. Let's grab skip, and that's coming from grid state.skip because it is not being changed. And take is also coming from grid state along with our new sort that is being changed. Now, when the page changes, we also need to make sure that we maintain sort. So let's save off sort, and that's coming from grid state.sort. Now let's have a look and refresh the page. And we're sorting by title in ascending order. If I click on title again, now it's sorting in descending order.
Here's our grid data that we're passing to the grid. We're just taking a slice of the state items. We're not actually sorting them here. We need to sort them and hand them to the grid already sorted. Let's do that.
We're going to use a function that comes from Kendo Data Query, and it's called order by.
And this function takes the data and then the sort descriptor array so that it can sort that data. Isn't that convenient? So we're going to hand this function this slice of the state that we've paged. And as the second parameter, I'm just going to pass in the sort descriptor, which is in our state. So now our grid data should be sorted. Let's take a look. Okay, so we're sorting in ascending order. If I go the other way, it's being sorted the other way. So sorting is working now. Next, let's take a look at a simpler way to configure sorting and paging using the Kendo Data Query. Now, while the Kendo Grid provides us individual attributes for paging and sorting and filtering, and while you still can use these if you want, there is an easier abstraction that you can use that'll make adding and removing data functions with your grid much simpler. This is called the Kendo Data Query. We already have it imported right at the top here, and we've been using the sort descriptor and the order by functions that come from the Kendo Data Query. In this lesson, we'll use a couple more of these to make working with data and the grid more maintainable and resilient. Kendo Data Query comes with something called state. It's pretty generically named, but think of it as a snapshot of your data at any given moment. And this state has nothing to do with the component state of the hosting component. So don't get those two confused. This is the state of the data for the grid. If we're going to be using state here, we need to add it to our component state.
Now our component already has state, but it's typed as any. We can actually use that state that we're importing from Kendo Data Query to strongly type our grid state. Now that we're strongly typing this, we can see what other properties are available on the state object by pressing Control Space here. And you'll see that we have filtering and grouping also available. Now, if you need to sort your grid initially by default, you can provide the initial sort descriptor, but we don't need to do that. So I'm going to delete it and just leave sort as an empty array. Let's go down to the grid, and we no longer need our onSort change function. The sorting is going to be handled automatically for us by the process function that we're going to import from Kendo Data Query. We'll do that in a bit. Same thing for onPage change. We don't need that anymore, but we do need a new function called onDataStateChange. This one new function will handle all the state changes of the grid for us. It'll provide the new data state for the grid. Let's call the handler for that onDataStateChange. Pass in our event, and we need to implement that. I'll comment out the old page change and the sort change handler since we don't need those. And let's create a new function called onDataStateChange, which is going to take an event of type gridDataStateChange event. All we need to do in here is set the grid state to the new data state that's coming in with the event.
Isn't that much cleaner and simpler? There's one more thing that's going to be cleaner and simpler, and that's the data we provide to the grid. So right now we're providing this grid data to our grid right over here, and we're calling state.items.slice, and we're passing in skip and take, and we're doing all these calculations and sorting and then order by. Well, we don't need to do any of that now. All we need to use is this process function that comes with Kendo Data Query. We're going to pass in the items that are on the state, and we're going to pass in the grid state. Let's make sure our process function is being imported, and we can get that from the Kendo Data Query. There we go. So now our process function is going to return a data result type, which the grid also understands. I'm going to save this, and let's take a look. Paging first. Paging is working. That's great. Our filtering is working. That's excellent. And our sorting is working. There's one more event we need to handle on this grid, and that's selection of an item. Right now, if I tap one of these items, nothing happens, but we're expecting to go to the details page. Let's take care of that next. Well, we've implemented all the requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 and the way we want the backlog to be displayed. However, unfortunately, we lost one of the events, and that's to be able to click on one of these items in the grid and be taken to the details page so we can do further editing. Well, the grid provides us with an event that we can handle, which is perfect for this scenario. And that's the onRowClick event. So right over here, I'm going to add the onRowClick event, and I'm going to handle that using the onSelectionChange event handler. This function doesn't exist yet, so let's go add one. Now, before we implemented the grid, and we just had a table, it had this list item tap event, which just navigated us to the item detail page. Our new function is going to be similar. Let's create a function called onSelectionChange, and the event type here is going to be gridRowClick event. The data item that's on the event is actually a PT item in our case, because we're binding our data of the grid to a list of items. So I'm going to cast it to PT item, and then I'm just going to use the same line as we had before to navigate to the detail page.
We do need to import the navigate hook. Let's do that up at the top here. That's called useNavigate, and that's coming from React Router DOM.
Here's our grid with our items. I'm going to tap on one of them, and we're on the details page. Perfect. There's a lot more to the grid than we've implemented here. As I mentioned before, it's a pretty complex component with a lot of different operations. There's filtering, there's grouping. I'll leave the filtering and grouping as an exercise to you.
In this lesson, we'll see the server capability, or RSC mode, of the KendoReact Grid. It's built for React server components and designed for performance. With RSC mode, the grid renders and handles operations like sorting, filtering, and paging on the server. The client only gets minimal JavaScript to enable interactivity, which means smaller bundles, quicker startup, and lighter CPU load in the browser. It fits perfectly with frameworks like Next.js using the app router. Just drop the grid into a server component and skip the use client directive. To run the server-side logic, just prefix your function with use server. You can still combine client and server actions if needed. Setup is simple. Import the grid, place it in a server-only page, and then you're done. No extra packages or separate APIs. Performance-wise, it avoids the usual JavaScript bloat of large grids. You can even tree shake features. For example, if you don't use grouping, that code doesn't ship. Feature support is already broad. Server or client-side sorting, paging, filtering, and selection. You can mix and match these as you need. You can also stream custom cells, localize content server-side, and trigger server actions directly from UI events. And if you want to stay client-only for small datasets, just use the grid in a client component as always.